Hello, and welcome to the Regrettable Century. I'm Chris.
I'm Kevin.
I'm Jason.
And say hi, Adam and Mir.
What's
We're
up,
back
y'all?
with us again.
Woohoo, your comrade in Christ from Sweden.
Alchemical Marxist gang, rise up.
So we're getting together this time to do the second section of, and in the way that we have arbitrarily divided it up, the second section of the Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition by Glenn Alexander McGee. This week, we're dealing with the...
Mythology of Reason.
There we go. The Mythology of Reason and Hegel's Initiation Rite. So, do we want to start it off with general thoughts?
I will say that the chapter on the Phenomenology actually inspired me to reread the Phenomenology, something I never thought I would do. So, it is saying quite a lot.
Yeah, same, but not right now.
Well, now that we're on a chapter about it, and we're going to be discussing it, I at least need to be in the process of reading it. And I gotta say, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, you are always in the process of reading Hegel because he's fucking impossible to read.
Yeah.
It's in vogue right now for people to say, Hegel's easy to read. You just have to read each word in succession.
Oh,
I mean, I don't know how other people read, but that's like foundational literacy. Like, would you like begin to read like every third word? Or how do you usually read books?
Well, if you're a speed reader, you can read like entire sections like in one glance, and generally, reading comprehension suffers a little bit. But if you're trying to grad school read something, it's like an essential it's an essential skill.
Yes, but like if you're reading philosophy or theory, that's basically impossible, or theology.
It's true.
Yeah, you know what one should do is get the Miller translation, which is the standard, and then get the Peter Fuss and John Dobbins translation, which is new, and read them side by side, because I did that for a little tiny bit, and then I wanted to throw them both away because
you realize that was a horrible mistake to do that.
And it's hard enough to read without considering that every single word that you're reading might be translated somewhat differently, and just sometimes to like dramatically different effect.
Especially from German to English, which is so fundamentally, I mean, it is languages which operates on different logics. If you compare Swedish to German, it's much more similar.
Well, and you have to take into consideration too, and we learned this from the book, that a lot of the language that Hegel is writing in is a particular vernacular of Swabian that is going to have a lot of the mystical shit that Hegel says is going to be implicit, and it doesn't necessarily translate in the way that he meant it into English if you're using a one-to-one translation. So, yes. I mean, I do read a little German, and one of the things that I always notice whenever I'm reading something in German and I'm like, what does this word mean again? And I look it up and it's like, oh yes, bad, good, near, far. All of the above.
I mean,
neither.
The Hegelian word, Aufhebung, which we translate to sublation, negation of the negation. I mean, that word I think has just caused who knows how many just train wrecks of trying to read through Hegel.
Yeah, exactly.
And especially with German translation into English, it is particularly hard because the English philosophical tradition has a longer positive or Aristotelian bent to it. There is a secularized philosophical language in English in a way that there aren't in German, because basically all the philosophical apparatus which the German language uses was created by Master Eckhart, which we talked about last time, so that each philosophical term in German is also a theological term. And has that kind of double meaning, which is not necessarily there in the English.
I would say, though, that I think because of that, you get Hegel out of Germany, but you get Ayn Rand out of the US, and I would definitely say that we come out on top.
Oh yeah,
Well-
absolutely.
Oh yeah.
One thing that could be
Who is young Galt?
said about that is that if Hegel's project is to conclude the project of philosophy, of which religion is a part, then the German language seems to be perfectly suited for it. Specifically, the way in which the not just the German language, but specifically they're not separated out, because as we are learning, Hegel does not regard that as a useful thing to do.
Sounds very folkish of you, Jason.
Well,
Yes.
German folkish ideology wasn't always the terrible,
Yeah.
disgusting, racist, nationalist thing that it became. I mean, there were definitely strands of it that were, but it wasn't always that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and Hegel was particularly not racist for his time, and his companion cohort of Schopenhauer was a fucking raging anti-Semite,
Yep.
and he was not a whatever you call it. He was very like
He was not woke.
he was not folkish. He did not care about the German folk at all, and he was very much thought himself superior to everybody else.
Yeah, he listened to Come Town.
All right, well, let's get started then.
Oh yes.
Um,
And like we will be talking, I have been designated like one of the more meteor chapter of this book, I would say.
Yep, and we made you do it at 1 a.m.
No, past 1 a.m.
That's true. It's almost 2 now.
It is 5 minutes to 2. I haven't slept in 18 hours. But like we talked about just now, Hegel's project, and when I try to grapple with the thought system, I always try to figure out like what is the question that is being answered here. And McGee pinpoints this quite well, that one of the more profound parts of Hegel's project was the binary between the philosopher king and the folk, the uneducated masses, and how that distinction could be resolved, how the splendid truth of philosophy could the common people to gain. And for the longest time, Hegel was of the opinion that the best way to do this was through the creation of a new religion. And because in each religion, in each religious practice is embedded metaphysical grammar, which structures everything in the smallest rite or liturgical practices. There is a whole set of metaphysical and theological presuppositions. So by developing a new religion, these kind of metaphysical thoughts could become a part of the social practice of everyday life. And that the best way to do this would be for philosophers to basically engineer a new religion. And the reason why Hegel thought this was that for him, religion and religious practices was a pre-reflective metaphysic and a pre-reflective thought form, and that philosophy had grown out of the practice of people trying to understand these practices and fleshing out the presuppositions. So first we have metaphysical practices that are inherent in our ortho practice, in our religious rites, and philosophy comes about by speculating and trying to understand the metaphysical presuppositions behind these. And when we have reflected upon these and understood the world even better, we could create a new foundation and new religious rites. And here we see the strong connection between both Marxist critique of ideology and the Freudian inheritance of psychoanalysis. Because what Hegel is really saying is that the goal of philosophy is to put religion on the couch of the psychoanalysis. And as we know, both Freud and Marx teachers were Ludwig von Feuerbach, which was a pupil of Hegel. So that is basically where one of the points of entry into understanding Hegel's obsession with religion.
What's really cool about that is that Hegel regards his project as making philosophy accessible to everyone, and I definitely think he accomplished that very well. No, I do really like the way that McGee puts it, where he had Hegel's he had an unwavering belief in the necessity of breaking this dichotomy between, religion and philosophy, to bring religion to its true essence. So like to put religion on the couch and do psychoanalysis is an interesting way to put it, but I think that it paints the picture just perfectly.
I was thinking about the idea of putting religion on the couch to be psychoanalyzed as a way of thinking about Hegel's system being speculative, which is really a way to talk about it being mystical, but also a process of recollection itself. Yeah, and I think that's also an interesting thing. I was curious what y'all thought about that, of this idea that speculative philosophy is really a process of recollection, and specifically the recollection of the perennial philosophy, as we talked about in the first episode too. And that's on page 86 at the bottom is where I'm reading that.
Just my thoughts on that were that there is both a religious and a political way of looking at that. Like, if the classical mystical tradition would be to reconcile oneself with the fall, but also remember a time before the fall in order to overcome it. The way that we in psychoanalysis try to remember and go through the trauma of childhood to heal ourselves and understand ourselves. But there is also, if we put it in political terms, trying to recollect the primal, what is the term in English? Primal communism? The first stage of primitive communism. Trying to recollect primitive communism, but not to return there, but to use the trauma of development and the trauma of the productive processes, to use the productive processes to bring us forth to communism through the recollection of primitive communism. So there is very nice parallels to draw there.
Yeah, it's the difference between Adam walking with God in the Garden of Eden and being equal and one with God, but merely in a de facto state of oneness. And the fall, and then the climb back, is the becoming co-equal, where when Adam is no longer a passive recipient of, but is in fact a co-constructor of, and is co-constitutive with God. That comparison to primitive communism in the Garden of Eden state, which is not literally the case, because I think the struggle for survival in the absence of production is pretty rough, seems like.
Yeah. But,
whatever. What the Romantics called man in his natural state, Adam in the Garden of Eden, the primitive communism, the parallels are all, it's all the same thing. It's all the same sort of primordial essence of who we are. In that sense, that what McGee says that Hegel is sort of like a Moses figure, and that he's come to lead people to finish the journey into the promised land.
Yes, and I think that this idea of recollection is really crucial, like both in recollection as a passive act of imagination and as creating oneself through the other, which we are creating as well, when we are helping God to create himself by letting God create us and gaze in his glory, is the classical mystical way of putting it. But if we put it in political terms, like we are trying to recall ways of being that is not mediated through our daily struggle with obsessive commodities and petty hierarchies. We are trying to, when we are practicing a communist project or trying to create communism, we want to recall another way of social being that perhaps has never been, but we still have in our DNA something that is trying to emerge, that is not this ruthless, alienated, obsessive, technological commodities.
Would you say that this memory exists within our collective unconscious? Because that seems to be
No,
what Hegel is saying here.
Yeah.
I mean, collective unconscious, that depends on what you're meaning with it. Like, I would say that it is in our DNA. We are social animals.
That's not what Hegel's saying.
Well,
Right.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, Hegel uses the word spirit, right?
Yeah.
Collective unconscious would be Jung's term, which
Yeah.
I think there's a straight line to be drawn from Hegel to Jung here on this point. But to use the language that Hegel used, he used the word spirit. I think primarily because he was psychoanalysis, like he was pre-Freud, so like the language of the unconscious didn't exist.
Well, that's what McGee uses. He says he uses the word unconscious.
Yeah.
I do want to read a quote about this. It's from page 85. It's in the Encyclopedia of Logic. Hegel says that the business of philosophy consists only in bringing into consciousness explicitly what people have held to be valid about thought from time immemorial. Thus, philosophy establishes nothing new. What we have brought forth by our reflection here is what everybody takes for granted without reflection, which is a pretty clear argument about a collective unconscious, at least in this particular passage.
Well, I would say that I think that discussion is from the first section of Phenomenology on sense certainty. It's this idea that what we take to be knowledge is not anything that we ever question. So I think that there is a distinction to be made for Hegel about whenever we talk about the, collective unconscious, is it like common sense that we're drawing upon? Or is it that we are, through the process of not just like seeking knowledge, but finding knowledge in Hegel's system, are we coming to access a collective unconscious, or are we coming to mirror the nature of the idea or spirit itself? So, because I would hold those to be two very different things.
Yes, and like the reason why I don't like the term collective unconscious is because it comes with the whole Jungian heritage, where Jung claimed that different people have different collective unconsciousness, which are bound to the earth. I think what Hegel is talking about here is something much more universal.
Yeah.
A more universal experience, and that collective unconscious is a part of our species being almost. Within neuropsychoanalysis, there is a great debate raging between like if we should count our DNA as unconscious, and so on and so forth. So when I say that we are seeking a social, we are social animal that is in our DNA, and our unconscious is trying to find ways to let that through.
I also think there's another implication here that whenever you read Jung talk about the collective unconscious, I think part of what the idea is, it's a very humanistic vision. Like he's invoking it to bring about a certain process of change, or, individuation, or the, working through of like the shadow self or whatever. And I think that Hegel's vision, if you want to say like, what is the role of the philosopher in his system? This is on page 88. He says, this is McGee. He says, Hegel's concept of speculation harks back to Pythagoras' comparison of the philosophers to spectators at the Olympic Games. The philosopher is a vehicle of the muses, an oracle through which the spirit expresses itself, an automatic writer who passively watches the play of the dialectic as it develops on his page. And I think that's very different than Jung's idea, which was always focused on this idea that the archetypes were really supposed to help you live your life in a different way, which was more true to your like authentic self. And I think Hegel's system is almost like subordinating like the individual to being part of something much more sort of universal or like metaphysical in nature.
Right.
Yeah.
What I was drawing attention to was that through this, there's a direct line through the way that Jung is thinking about things and the way that Hermeticists think about things. And I think that I'm not saying that this is exactly the same thing. I was just drawing that line. But yeah, you're totally right. With Hegel is clearly much more collective with his idea of any sort of collective unconscious, if we were to use that term.
Hegel is also interested in arriving at a better way of living in the world too. It's not just a matter of knowing things, right? Because that's what it means to live in the era of the consummation of freedom, is that like human beings can finally, in order to achieve a thinking unity with God, they can finally be architects of their surroundings, as opposed to merely just like unthinkingly going through the processes of constructing society. Which is why I think, in as much as it's similar and also different than what Jung says, it's also very similar, although different from what Marx says about the exact same thing, right? Which is like, we still live in the same age that Hegel did, in this era of the consummation of freedom, and we are still trying to learn how to live in that world and be fully conscious constructors and architects of our own collective experience.
And this language is all very, very Masonic, which is Hermetic language.
Which is not purely Christian language, but very close to it.
It is Christian of a sort. Yeah.
Yeah. While the normal way of looking at it and the Jungian way of looking at it would be that we would try to like live more content and fulfilled lives with less anxiety and so on and so forth. What Hegel and the mystics want to do is like, no, they want us to force us to confront this trauma that we are the subjects of history, and to force us to reflect upon God, on the truth, on the absolute. And while doing that, we are left alone with the knowledge that we can no longer trust in God, but God trusts in us. We are the subjects of history, and we are confronted with that sin, with that pure anxiety of freedom and of responsibility, which is a trauma. And that is not supposed to make us more content. That is almost a crippling freedom that he's trying to force us to confront. At least that's my reading of it. I could be wrong there. I could be reading in much too much in it.
Yeah, freedom feels bad, man.
Yeah,
but no, I don't think it would be pretty difficult, I think, to convince anybody that any reading of Hegel is reading too much into it. But I think that might be something of a flattening of Jung, actually. But we're not reading a book on Jung.
That's true. That's
so,
true.
like, we can set this distinction to the side as a way of sort of understanding Hegel and the text that we are engaging with.
Yeah.
Like the thing that you're demarcating is correctly demarcated as distinct from what Hegel is saying. I think you're right there.
And like that is one of the like to become a fundamentally more human person, a more Christian person in the Christian tradition, is to be accept their responsibility and know that I alone, we as a human species alone, bear this responsibility. And this can, according to Hegel, only happen after the end of history. And that cannot happen before the fall. That cannot happen in primordial communism. That cannot happen in the Garden of Eden. Why? Because of the fact that we have to be confronted with that freedom. And in Marxist terms, in order to be confronted with that freedom, we have to develop a certain means of production. Like, we cannot longer be whims to the nature of history. We have to have a basic technological and practical understanding of nature in order to become masters of our own fate. And we have, according to Hegel, reached a sufficient technological and social praxis in the world that we are able to be confronted with that responsibility and that freedom. We can no longer say that this order of nature and the social order is given by nature or given by God, because we can control nature. So that is actually quite a Marxist explanation, that the forces of production and the social relations of production precedes consciousness, and that it's only after
Wait, say that again. What precedes consciousness?
The forces and the relations of production has to be developed to a certain point for consciousness to be able to process.
So a Sartrean existence precedes
Essence.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is,
Thank you. I was struggling for the word
Yeah.
essence. I was like,
You got essenced from all corners.
well, speaking of struggling, Marx puts it in very, very similar terms, but I'm suddenly blanking on in the way he puts it.
Because Sartre was a weird Marxist. He was a Marxist, but a very, very weird one.
I mean, same, to be honest.
Well, so yeah, same. I remember what I was thinking of was when Marx says that social being determines consciousness.
Yeah.
different expressions, or perhaps one might say different aspects of a united substance.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is part of the Hermetic tradition that Hegel is explicating herein. Is sort of he doesn't just like give you a logically linear argument from A to Z. You know, if A then B, B then C, so on or whatever. He's doing a lot of just associative thinking around some truth that is between the holes in language. You know.
Yeah, that's why he says that negation itself is creative, because the posited term has become isolated and thus was itself negated. The whole is immanent in the development of consciousness.
Yes, and like, this is a thinker that we haven't touched on yet is Pascal, blessed Pascal, and he put this very neatly, like, if you have trouble believing in God, as if you believe, and the consciousness will fall of God's grace will follow after. And that is a problem for the left, because we, like, a practical problem, because we are caught in this weird performative sect action where we sell newspapers and continue to do the same things over and over again, and we believe that those things work because we keep on doing them. Like, I'm thinking of all these weird trot sects and the MLs, the political parts of Marxism. Or we continue to try to understand things, and we get caught in that loop of performative understanding, which never leads to action.
Yeah, I would like to think that we are for a synthesis of performative action and performative understanding.
Oh, yes.
No, but I mean, I don't. Anybody who's familiar with the Lost Horizons network will be familiar with my admonitions for us to accept a Marxist Pascal's wager, because even if you don't believe that a better world is possible, behave as though you do.
Yes.
So that's like, I guess that's what's at the end of hopelessness is a wager.
Unironically, yes.
Like, and one of the harder things to do is like to connect that with my favorite quote from Gramsci. I think that is one of my personal mottos. What is needed is the pessimism of the intellect, but the optimism of the will.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is Marxist Pascal's wager, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, this is good standard Lost Horizons fare right here. This is the fish and chips of the Lost Horizons menu.
At the risk of bringing it back to the text,
No, don't do that.
the one thing I would say, though, is I think that
Give me a page number.
I don't know. My head. I'm just kind of winging
80,
it. But I'm around 80, 88, 89.
Okay.
But I was thinking about, I mean, in Hegel's dialectic, he mentions that, part of this process is that negation has to occur. Like, there has to be this sort of division and splitting off for then that to sort of like be returned back to this initial point through mediation. And I think that in a way, like, what we're describing is that, the losing of all hope for me is like tearing with the negative, as Hegel calls it. Like, it is fully tearing with the negatives to such a degree that you fully negate things to such a degree that you can return back and know your starting point for the first time. And it's the whole process, I think, that to me is why a lot of the Lost Horizons, chill vibes / ideology is really about this dialectical process. So I think that's part of the wager. It's like you have to like have pessimism as the intellect because you've gone through the process of negation. And then the sort of optimism of the will is the sort of negation of the negation is how I would think about it.
And
Alpha bone.
to put
And
this in religious terms, like I am detecting this is perhaps my Catholic self, but I am detecting a critique of Luther here and Lutheranism, that what is needed is not only this what Hegel is reacting against with this Abhebung is this unconditional belief that God will save us, that faith alone will save us.
Oh, I thought you were making a different critique of Luther.
Yes. And that instead, in the Eckhartian way and the Catholic way, God trusts in us to save him and to redeem the world.
Right. I see. Whenever you said a critique of Luther, I thought you were going to make a critique of the Reformation, like that it shouldn't have happened.
Oh,
but,
yeah, like
but it had to happen. Catholicism wouldn't be as good as it is now if not for the Reformation.
Yeah.
That's the power of negation.
Yeah.
So, and similarly, Protestantism became the worst, which is why it had to have its own Reformation, and which is where you get Swabians and Oettinger and stuff like that.
Yeah, Mir said the Catholic way as opposed to the Protestant way. And if you're familiar with the Book of James at all, it's just the Christian way.
Yeah.
As opposed to the Calvinist way, which is bullshit. But
Exactly.
we can move on to the next section if you guys like.
My favorite note that I wrote in so far on this chapter is, by Greek standards, Hegel is undeniably guilty of hubris.
I think by pretty much any standards.
Yes. But what I like is that he actually has a material foundation or an explanation for why he could know more than the Greeks. And that is that he is at the end of history, that now the technological and the social knowledge of the human species as a collective has emerged to that point where we can no longer view ourselves as victims to the natural order, but as the true object of the true subject of history instead of its object.
Should we talk about parallels between speculation and myth?
Well, I mean, Adam really picked up really good on that one, but like speculation and recollection and myth, it basically returns to this foundational egalitarian project of Hegel, which is how to make religion possible for the common people.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
And the fact that after Schelling convinced Hegel to abandon the project of creating a new religion, he basically engaged in aesthetics instead, and that it is this very nice quote that truth and goodness become sisters in beauty, And what she means by that is not that through truth and goodness that philosophy and ethics has to become art, but that truth and goodness can only be expressed in art, or have to be expressed in art, in artistic forms, in order for people to be able to grasp it. Because otherwise we would end up with, as in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, this really weird answer which nobody could relate to. The meaning of the universe is 42. Yeah, what does that mean? We we have to translate this, both the question and the answer, into a mythic form. In the Catholic tradition, that is through the liturgy. And this is another dichotomy which Hegel is real obsessed with, and that is the fact that through the Enlightenment, the more hard sciences and the more humanistic sciences departed, and he wants to find a way to reunite them, and that this can only be accomplished in a new language, in an artistic language. And that is the goal of the philosopher, to create this language which enable us to re-enchant the world with all our new knowledge.
Right. That's why he says, until we express ideas aesthetically and mythologically, they have no interest for the people. And until mythology is rational, the philosopher must be ashamed of it.
So I think there are a couple of key things just about the method here. I'm on page 93. I'll just link together a couple of things. McGee says, the magic power is dialectic guided by recollection. And as we shall shortly find, our access to this power is through the form of imagination. So I think one of Hegel's critiques has a lot to do with the structure of language, where it is subject and then predicate, and the way that it inherently always places the subject in this hierarchical position. And I think part of what he's saying is that the way that recollection happens and why it has to be through the imagination, because if we say the answer to the universe is 42, again, it's the structure of language itself which creates this nonsensical nature of that as capital T truth. So I think for Hegel, and this is a word that comes from Eric Neumann, who's a Jungian, he talks about it as circumscription. That truth is not subject and then predicate. It is the way that we create a multiple set of symbols or systems to sort of circumspect or almost orbit around something that is ineffable. And it is through the imagination and the sort of mythical poetic function that happens. So I think for me, that's a really key part of why Hegel is approaching it this way as well.
Yes, and to grasp this point, I think Zizek is actually one of the best theoreticians to grasp this point when he's talking about signifiers, what Hegel is talking about with re-enchanting the world and bridging the gap between the natural and the humanistic sciences, is that the goal of the philosopher is to enchant words with new meaning, not create new words, but have the words we already use point to something different.
Yeah, I think the Lacanian sort of thought about this that always struck me as truth is told in the form of a lie.
Yes, and the classical political way of doing this, it's all the bank's fault. Of course, it's not the bank's fault. It's the capitalist system, which runs on the falling rate of profit, yada, yada, yada. But by loading the term bank with a new meaning, we can use the word bank to point toward a new direction.
So I think the next time you're talking to an Alex Joneshead who's fighting the info war, the main way to respond is to say, you're engaging in propositional thought, and I'm going to reject that, and you need to think more dialectically.
I mean, look,
and they will
that's-
completely understand what you mean then.
Exactly.
They were like, oh, I never thought of it that way.
honestly, that's just as true when you're talking to the average
Liberal, yeah.
Well, it's funny.
Marxist.
I was gonna. It's funny you should say liberal
Everybody.
because I was gonna say the average, pro-revolutionary type on the existing left.
Same thing.
Yeah,
Sorry, both of these pictures look the same to me.
yeah. Look,
I just wanted to say something about imagination in Western esoteric practice as concerns the being able to contemplate God and it being a meditative technique that is more heavily used in the West. It's also definitely used in Eastern practices as well. But in the West, the process of building structures within your imagination is a super important part of meditative practice. And this whole section here, it's just like reasoning around God. And the whole idea of the mythopoetic as being the way that you can imagine the things that help you conceive of the aspects of God that you're trying to understand, which is very Gnostic as well as Hermetic, but it's just shot through the Western esoteric tradition, and it's super interesting to see this just used as philosophical practice here for Hegel. And I mean, I just think that being able to understand Hegel as a Hermeticist, I think makes him so much easier to understand. I know we keep saying that, but yeah.
I'm not exactly sure that can be emphasized too much.
Yeah.
No.
I'm sure that's the argument of literally every word of this book.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say too that along what you were saying, Chris, I think that the reason why Hegel rejects propositional thought to approach the absolute in this way is because propositional thought inherently must define something. And how do you define that which is ineffable and the absolute? And I think this is also why Hegel's approach to the dialectic and through recollection is in a way to begin the process of dialectically moving through this set of stages or this motion. He says that in a way you already kind of know the terms that you're trying to work out and define. In a way it's that's part of why this isn't about defining something. It's almost by starting at any given point and starting to dialectically work through that process, you eventually come to some element or some aspect of the absolute, but without defining it in a way. And to me, that's kind of why saying he's a Hermetic thinker is just, that makes a lot more sense if you have the Hermetic framework to think through that.
Hegel's ideas are already in everyone's heads.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we would take examples from two different fields, because I like to give examples, it is like, one is the study of black holes in space. We cannot study them. We can only study their effect on things around them.
That's actually a great example.
Yeah.
Because of how many times, if you say it's like somebody has like a popular science article about some sort of astrophenomena that can basically only be reasoned mathematically, right? And then all the comments from all the smartest people who have ever watched YouTube are like, have these idiots even been to a black hole? How do we even know? Like, you can't see it, so it's not true. And it's like, empiricism really, it really shows its limitations every day.
Also, Matthew McConaughey has been to a black hole.
Wait, what? When?
That movie.
It happened for reals. I think it was about 5 years ago.
What was the movie?
It was
What are you
Interstellar.
guys talking about?
Interstellar was the movie.
Interstellar, yeah.
Also, I will say
Last
a much better depiction of actually going into a black hole is the movie High Life with Robert Pattinson, because that's also about violating the incest taboo at the same time. So that's where it's at.
Cool.
My favorite movie about going into a black hole is Event Horizon.
Actually, that wins. Totally agree.
Yeah.
The last McConaughey film I remember was The Free State of Jones, which is not about black holes at all. It's about the Civil War.
But when we are talking about incest, I think another way to look at this is through the Freudian trauma, actually. And I am returning to this all the time, but I want us to understand that we cannot emphasize enough that Freud was an Hegelian thinker. Freud's teacher and the only philosopher he really liked was Feuerbach. And if you think about the Freudian trauma, you can never truly understand it. You can only see how the trauma affects you, and like you approach it through its effects, through dreams, through social interactions. You can never truly confront the darkness within the person.
There was a point earlier, and I can't remember where it was now, but I was looking for this in my notes, and I finally found it. It says the dialectic does not concern itself at each step with truth. It moves by canceling false, partial, and illusory positions. And at one point, that was like a perfect summation of what we were talking about, but I just can't recall what it was now. But it's still true.
Yes.
I'd like to think that that's what we're constantly in the process of, like as a podcast anyway, and a network is just canceling out the false things, engaging with as much as we possibly can in order to try to synthesize something, which for the most part is just us disagreeing. But in the process of disagreeing, we're also like deciding what it is that we actually think. So it's not just purely negative. There's some good stuff going on in there, guys. I promise.
Right. Well, that's
typical left, just doing cancel culture.
Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of
actually.
That reminds me of now of why I was thinking about this, because it was the conversation about pessimism.
Cancel culture as negative theology.
I would totally be down for that version of it. I will say, I think one of the things that's important is that most of what we encounter in like most discourse, especially in online communities and in most of the left groups I've been part of, I think perfectly fits into what Hegel calls sense certainty. It's this adoption or sort of just taking your basic sense experience as, well, that must absolutely be true. And I think if you take dialectic in this approach seriously, the only way to move or progress through the stages towards something that could be circumspection around the absolute, you have to negate that. That is the only way to actually move that process, is to negate it. So I think that in a way, just disagreeing with everything is ideally always in the service of a movement, a process that would ideally return back and take the initial thing and then allow it to sort of be related to at a different and, you know, dare I say, like higher level, or, you know, a level that's been aufgehoben.
Yes, yeah, like that, and that is what Hegel means when he says that speculation is reflection.
Yeah,
is speculation and remembering a reflection, and we are trying to purify our memory of that reflection of God by canceling out our own prediction, by weeding out our own projections of that image.
Right, and that's why that's what's really cool about coming to this sort of awareness is that 3 years ago we had this conversation about doing this podcast, and the purpose of it was to look back on the wreckage of the 20th century left and try to figure out what in its aspirations do we want to try to reclaim, and what in its let's say in its implementations do we think is better left as wreckage, right? To salvage through and recompose a left, to recompose basically Marxism in this kind of new moment based on negating the negation that was the end of history, so to speak. So it's really great years on to have finally found like the language for that project. Another way of putting it is that we kind of already knew, but now we know even more than we knew, or now that we know that we knew.
Well, it's not unconscious wisdom anymore.
That's exactly right. Well, it's an effect of the divine at work within us.
Unironically, yes.
Yeah.
I think that we have touched upon most of the really good points in this chapter, except the triangle part, which the divine triangle. Otherwise, I think we have touched on the most immediate part of the mythology of reason. What do we have to say upon the divine triangle and the triangle of the divine?
The first thing that I wrote down for this chapter is a kind of paraphrasing of McGee. It says that Hegel's conscious appropriation of Hermetic thought as well as his return to Christianity, is a reconciliation between philosophical reason and Christian revelation. So it's an extension of the previous conversation about negation as a constructive, as an aspect of construction.
Well, at the risk of describing the triangle the way that one might describe a mean, it's a triangle, and then it has 3 smaller triangles at the points of the big triangle in the middle, and it has a bunch of very heavy metal looking symbology, and it says spiritus. And everyone who is on the network is now obligated to get it as a tattoo, including you.
Yes.
Damn.
All right, let me read this because this actually is, I think, a pretty good summation. This is on page 110. He says that the triangle represents Hegel's mature philosophy, and that Hegel claims that the earth as the self-consciousness of God is now the spirit. Nature itself, excluding man, is one form in which the idea of God finds concrete expression. But God's self-consciousness is achieved only through a natural terrestrial being that simultaneously rises above nature to the ideal, mankind or spirit. So I think the triangle is basically trying to show sort of this as above, so below, as within, as without sort of idea, and how they're like mirroring each other, but they both are necessitating each other to be spirit. To be spirit is to be humankind or mankind knowing God as itself. And it just looks super fucking cool.
All the heavy metal imagery is all alchemical symbolism.
Right. I like that McGee included a little a legend, I guess what you would call it if it was a map, a little for translation purposes. The other side of that page has the meaning of all of those symbols, and I thought I had marked the chapter, but I didn't apparently.
It's 112.
Yeah. So the symbols are Saturn, Mercury, Virgo, Leo, Capricorn, Sagittarius, Sulfur, Mercury, Caput Mortuum, Gold, a question mark. Not the symbol's not a question mark. It's the symbol is noted with a question mark. 5-point star, 6-point star, another even crazier symbol with a question mark. Triangle, Moon, Sun, Mars, Pisces, Jupiter, another question mark, and someone help me out with this. Potash / antimony.
And caput mortuum is literally means dead head, like a dead head in Latin, which is garbage left over from an alchemical experiment that has no new use or meaning. I don't know what potash is.
So it's really cool actually to see in Hegel's pictographical depiction of his science, of his fully worked out realization of philosophy, that there is in the movement of spirit, there is dead leftover like alchemical residue behind as God in himself, God for himself, and God unto himself, or the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or the project of human beings coming to full consciousness of freedom, leaves behind the wreckage of partial truths which have been negated in favor of closer approximations to absolute truth.
The wreckage of history which the angel of history is forced to look upon as the ruins of our previous failures are gathered all around us.
That's right. It's really cool actually. Like when I first turned the page to this symbol, I was like, oh cool, this explains things, I guess. After having read the chapter, I am convinced that this actually explains a lot. And now I do feel like I can say we are definitely all getting this BFF Hegel Understanders tattoo.
Hegel Understanders Club.
And even we don't understand Hegel.
Yeah.
Remember Hegel's comment, no one does. Well, only one person did, and even that person did not.
What a total like jackass thing to say.
Hegel and Lacan has to be some of like the 2 most pretentious, self-absorbed philosophers in the history.
Yep.
Doesn't mean they were wrong, though.
No.
Listen, if you found the Holy Grail, which I know is a little foreshadowing for the next chapter, but you might feel a little full of yourself too.
Yeah.
But I do want to say, I do think that this was an important note from McGee. This is on page 119. It's just that he says the triangle diagram is only a step in Hegel's thought. So it should not be just so that we're being honest and we are not misconstruing this as the final product. This is merely an early attempt by Hegel to really, it looks like, to understand what it is that he's understanding in the process of becoming not a philosopher but the philosopher.
And what I think he means there, or what we can take away from there, is that as Marxists and as thinkers overall, we usually try to systematize ways in like these abstract graphs and structures with the superstructure and the base and the means of production and so on and so forth. And all those abstract graphical representation is important step in thinking, but we should never get caught in that systematization. It has to be incorporated and left behind, but it's still a phase that we have to go through.
Yeah, well, what does he say? One must explore the blind alleys that promise illumination, but do not deliver, in order to be purified of false presuppositions.
Word, man.
Yeah. My final note on this chapter is this was really a note to myself and also all Marxists who believe that they fully understand Hegel because they read someone talking about Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. I thought this note was important to kind of close off the chapter. It says that Hegel's system is not a theory of the world. It is a means to transfigure our experience and effect of being in the world, which is to say that when Marx says up to this point the philosophers have merely interpreted the world, the point is to change it. He's not actually disagreeing with Hegel. He's agreeing with Hegel so much that he's, I don't think he even knows how much he's agreeing with Hegel.
Last thing I want to tag on, this is on 122 at the bottom. He says, this is Hegel, spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face and tearing with it. This tearing with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. And I just want to say that negation as magic in the dialectic is, I think, part of the connection point with what we were talking about, the necessity of negation. Like for Hegel, that is in itself this magical process. Hear that, kids? Negate everything. Do magic. Do drugs. Drop out of school.
What Adam said in a secular way would be to embrace the despair, to force ourselves to face the ruins and to face the hopelessness of our project. That this century and the past was regrettable. And we have to force ourselves to face that failure and the hopelessness that those failures have brought us.
Yeah.
Pessimism,
but a dialectical pessimism.
Yeah, by way of trying to do a segue, McGee does refer to the Phenomenology of Spirit as Hegel's grimoire.
Speaking of Hegel's grimoire.
Yeah, it didn't work. Never mind. Just go ahead and jump right in.
Okay, chapter 6 of this book, McGee does a close reading and dissection of Hegel's book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, and his thesis for this chapter, like every chapter of the book, is that Hegel is a Hermetic, and the book is engaging in the Hermetic tradition. Specifically, the Phenomenology of Spirit is endeavoring to conduct, according to McGee, it is endeavoring to conduct an initiation rite that one would find in the Hermetic tradition, which is not actually a part of the acquisition of knowledge itself, but it is a preparatory process one must pass through in order to receive true knowledge. So for Hegel, this is not the ascent, or the Phenomenology of Spirit is not the ascent, but rather it is the clearing of the path to ascend. In order to make this argument, McGee, he quotes Schelling and says that Schelling remarks that the purpose of all the mystery rites is none other than to show men the archetypes of all that they are accustomed to seeing in images. Hegel's phenomenology is an initiation into the knowledge of these archetypes, which he says are the categories of the logic, via a transcendence of the understanding, with its penchant for the particular and for the image. So, and then he goes on to say that the phenomenology is just, it is a gallery of images. It is the self-display of the phenomena of the spirit. And he makes reference to Heidegger's Greek phenomenon, which he defines as meaning that which shows itself or makes itself manifest. So, by conducting an analysis of phenomenology itself and phenomenology of spirit, he's preparing our minds to receive a truer understanding of the complete nature of existence. And then he lays out the structure of the chapter to come, and he says that
hey Kev, before you lay out the structure, can I just add in 2 quick sentences I think are just real succinct and very good?
Yeah, please.
He says the phenomenology displays the forms in which spirit has appeared in time. We may think of each as a mode of consciousness or mind. Hegel shows how each mode is an approximation of what he calls at the end of the book, absolute knowing.
So Hegel's argument is that all philosophy, including Hegel's, presupposes that at least some men, yearn to know themselves and the world fully. Wisdom and self-satisfaction do not consist, however, in ego aggrandizement, but in the transcendence of the ego and identification with spirit as such. In Hegel's view, we have to annihilate our own selfhood in order to enter the sphere where philosophy herself speaks. So if the task of phenomenology is to achieve the transcendence of the self, then the phenomenology begins to look like a mystical initiation, preparing the self for true knowledge. And so he says that this fits in the Hermetic initiation, falls into 2 phases, the former emphasizing self-knowledge and the latter knowledge of God. The phenomenology can be thought of as a voyage of self-discovery, whereas the rest of the system, also a tortuous way, is a discovery of the absolute or of God. So in this chapter, he argues that Hegel was in close contact with the Masons at the time of the writing of the phenomenology, and at least one Mason wrote in a letter that he understood the text to be a Masonic document. And he also makes use of Eleusis, which was a highly Masonic poem. And he also uses other Masonic imagery in the text. And he goes on in the chapter to lay these out and argue them out.
Do you think that Mason was the person that Hegel said, only one person understood me, and even that person didn't understand me?
May have been, actually. That's a good question. That's a good point, actually. So anything on the section on initiation that anybody wants to toss in before we move on to the Hermetic influences?
I do like the way that McGee makes it a point to describe what is meant to be understood as an initiatory process, which is an extremely torturous means through which one abandons what one is used to in order to retrace one's steps to primordial thoughts. Primordial things. Which is to say, initiation is not just like, have you recited the words? It's meant to be tough. It's meant to be hard to do. It's meant to be a slog. It's meant to like tire you out, wear you out, and really make you question whether or not you're ready for this. And as we were talking about earlier in this conversation, that's what reading the phenomenology is actually like.
Yeah, it's not telling you something. It's not being a teacher who is like opening your brain and pouring knowledge in. It is trying to help you to change your being in the world.
I was just saying, like in Masonic initiation rites, there's a incredibly grueling process as well, where you have to memorize a catechism and recite that back flawlessly in order to become a Mason. And within that catechism, there's a bunch of contradictory statements and weird symbolic statements that could be confusing and not make any sense. And what you do is you work through all of those in order to understand them before reciting them.
I also think that, as Kevin mentioned, there is a difference between working through self-knowledge and that you have to start with self-knowledge in order to be able to learn the knowledge of God afterwards. I don't know how it is internationally, but in Sweden, if you want to become a psychoanalyst, you have to first go through 1 to 5 years of psychoanalysis where you work through your own dad issues and mama issues and whatever it is, and then you are allowed to start a formal education. And it is the same thing when I converted to Catholicism. First, I had to go through like spiritual guidance with a priest, and after that, I was allowed to start to study the catechism.
Yeah, it's not altogether unfamiliar to people in the most vulgar ways, although we don't really recognize it as such. But there's a pale echo of this whenever pledges rush a fraternity and they have to run around wearing diapers and stuff. It's like, do you really want to do this, bro? Do you really want to be one of us? And we probably would do well as communists to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, some organizations do that.
Yeah, actually, we probably shouldn't do that.
Gatekeep, dog. Gatekeep.
Yeah. Start a fight club.
Well, to our, in our internal secret systems, like Rosicrucian Jesuit type orders inside of the movement, then we should do that.
Yeah, in our Knights of Labor.
And like there is a deep mystical understanding in that you have to confront the darkness within you in order not to project onto God your own problems. Or in political terms, like even in a communist society, you would have, or a post-patriarchal society in feminist terms, you would still have personal trauma. You cannot use the feminist or the communist struggle as an excuse to get back at your old boyfriend or your personal boss. Those are things you have to work out privately before you can understand what the true project is about.
Mir, I think you just destroyed 99% of all the left in the U.S. with that single statement.
It's like, Mir, you're canceled for calling out the entirety of Twitter users.
Yeah. I like that McGee includes this Bohm quote that Hegel apparently was very fond of. That says, "Nothing can be revealed to itself without opposition." I think the extremely torturous initiation process is a critical part of not just preparing oneself to understand Hegel, right, but also to do, what does he say here? And so that so that human beings can engage in their vocation, or the vocation of spirit, which is human consciousness, right? To transform the given world and make it conform to the idea, capital I, right? To remove the distinction between real and ideal, subject and object, and engage in the process of transformation.
I think there's a really interesting reading here too, just in line with, or I should say, kind of in contradiction to, I think, things around psychoanalysis and Hegelianism becoming more sort of ascendant in a lot of the left, or at least some sections of the left. So this is the phrase that Hegel uses, which is substance becoming subject. So this is on page 136. He says, Hegel speaks of substance becoming subject, claiming that the absolute is the process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal, having its end also as its beginning. Only by being worked out to its end is it actual. So that phrase, I think, has just been used a lot, but I think that's a really, again, in the Hermetic context, it makes a lot more sense to me, I think.
I thought this part was interesting, where he says that, McGee says that the perfect Hegelian wise man would possess both self-satisfaction and consciousness, and that in order to achieve that, self-annihilation must occur. There must be an annihilation of the sense of self, and more like a sublation of the sense of self into the whole.
Yeah.
The dark night of the soul.
Philosophy, right? Philosophy will only speak to us after the self has been transcended. So Hegel is arguing for ego death here.
Yeah.
Ego death is necessary for us to be able to receive philosophy and receive the understanding that is necessary.
And I think in Jungian terms, shadow work.
Shadow work. Well, not just Jungian terms. Shadow work is also a term that's utilized in what they call ceremonial magic as well.
Yeah, also shamanic practices as well.
That's what That's what Jungianism is. It's ceremonial magic as psychoanalysis.
Yes.
Yeah. I like that this conversation reminds me of the last time we got to hang out with Adam when we talked about the project of trying to like learn how to be good communists, and like not just being engaging in this constant reaffirmation of the self at the expense of the other. I didn't even realize that what we were doing in talking about mental illness and the eternal project of mental health, right, or acquiring greater degrees of it, that what we were doing is we were having a shadow version of the conversation about the phenomenology as initiatory rite.
Yeah, I had the mushroom tell me that basically mental health and healing is just remembering, and that you have to die before you die.
Well,
Hell yeah.
And I mean, a political way of thinking about this, and this is perhaps a little bit too gloomy, but we have to realize that we are caught up in the system that everything we do is overdetermined, and we are basically just pawns in a systematical network. We have to go through that complete lack of agency within the capitalist system in order for us to become actors.
Yeah, well, on that note, and that moving us quite far along in the chapter, I like that Hegel asserts that evil is a moment of God, right? And he refers to Lucifer as the first son of light, like not as antagonist to God in the way that is classically understood within Christianity, but a part of the process of negation, right? That the fall of Lucifer, that nature is, the separation of nature from God is a critical part of the ascent of nature back to God, right? So, like in Hegel's view, Lucifer turns out to be a manifestation of God.
I mean, that's not that uncommon.
No.
I mean, even one of the more orthodox Catholic, which is Chesterton, I mean, he's really mainstream, claims that in his beautiful novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, like, the back of God is Lucifer and the front of God is Christ.
The Process Church, that weird sort of semi-linked to the Manson family cult that didn't actually murder anybody, but was just weird. They had part of their belief is that Jesus and Lucifer are twins, both of which are aspects of God. So they worship God and Lucifer together. But there is one Gnostic myth where the snake in the garden, which is often conflated with Lucifer, gives divine wisdom to Adam and Eve to tell them that they are, divine sparks trapped in imperfect matter, stuff like that, just basic Gnostic fare. And that the snake is a Promethean figure. In Gnosticism and in, a lot of Western esotericism, the snake is equated with the principle of divine wisdom. So, there is a little bit of Gnostic sort of Luciferian Prometheism that pops up in and out of the Gnostic tradition. A lot of modern Gnostics just straight up equate Lucifer with a lesser sort of Promethean figure, whereas Christ would be the ultimate Promethean figure.
Well, that's why I like calling it, that Hegel calls him the very first born son of light. Like it bestows upon Lucifer a really, not just important in the sense of like a story needs a villain, right? But a very constructive, right? That the fall of Lucifer is a determinate negation.
I also think it's necessary. That was kind of also how I read it too.
I mean, this is a theme that has been explored greatly in fiction. The Man Who Was Thursday by Chesterton. There is also a short story in Neil Gaiman's collection, Smoke and Mirrors, who depicts this, and where God says after Lucifer has fallen, this beloved son of mine has the greatest burden and the most important burden of all to bear. And also Origenus, one of the early church fathers, extremely influential. He was excommunicated, but he claimed that even the devil, even Lucifer, would be redeemed for his part in creation.
He was also posthumously unexcommunicated, though.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, don't worry, he got to go to heaven.
Yeah,
and all this makes sense because I mean, if you claimed that Lucifer was somehow opposed to or outside of God in some way, you're reducing the omniscience of God himself, and so like, it seems very fitting in Orthodox Christian theology to have the devil be in some at least very abstracted sense an aspect of God or moment of God himself.
In old ancient Jewish theology, the Satan, right, appears as like sort of a prosecutor in the throne room of God, and that's who God sends after Job, or not? He doesn't send him, makes the wager with him to test Job. So it's like there's not an adversarial relationship between God and Satan. Is that right? Is that the word that's used? Satan, yeah. Not Satan. Satan is delicious. Yeah, that's adversary Satan. Or accuser. Accuser. That's the word I'm thinking of. Accuser is the word that Satan means in Hebrew, and yeah, he's part of God's
about in
court.
Job.
Yeah, in the book of Job. Yeah, and so there's this pretty decent book called The Origins of Satan by Elaine Pagels, who she's good sometimes and also not great sometimes, but she goes through a number of origin myths from where Satan comes from, and I recommend that to people.
So let me just jump in where the text starts us out here. That he starts by giving us a historical context for where and when Phenomenology of Spirit was written. It was he says it was conceived and written in Jena, where Hegel lived for about 6 years, and during this period, he gave his lectures on the philosophy of nature, which reflected his ongoing interest in alchemy. But specifically, he goes through and demonstrates through historical documents like letters and things that were written by other people who hung out with Hegel and talked about to Hegel and that sort of thing. It says that it was in Jena that Hegel became deeply immersed in Böhme specifically. And during this period, Hegel became deeply immersed with initially an uncritical enthusiasm, then later gained a little critical distance, but remained sympathetic. But either way, it was well known that Hegel had an interest in sympathy for Böhme, and there were other people that he was engaging with who encouraged his interest in Böhme during this time.
Cool tidbit. One of the greatest battles of the Napoleonic War was happening right outside of the city as Hegel was writing the Phenomenology.
Yeah. This is where you get, Napoleon as history on horseback. Bonaparte is the embodiment of the movement of spirit in the world. So I think it's really cool. It's not just a thing that Hegel thinks. It's a thing that Hegel witnesses in all of its destruction, but he recognizes the creative impulse in the act of destruction that is being invaded by the Grande Armée.
In other words, based.
Yeah, super based.
Right, and that's also
revolutionary defeatism.
That's also where he supposedly came up with the end of history, because the defeat of the Prussian state so decisively by Napoleon seemed to him to be the end of history.
Yeah, it's a apocalyptic vision in which the world is being reborn, right? It's the flood, it's the book of Revelation,
and apocalypse in the also unveiling that there is this tapestry before the mirror of God and before the mirror of history that is falling down, and we can now see that mirror, see the face of God, see our own agency in that mirror.
The rending of the veil of the Holy of Holies, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
McGee goes into the text a textual analysis of the preface to demonstrate that Hegel is saying that he's doing Hermeticism in the preface. And then he goes through and does an analysis of the full text of Phenomenology of Spirit to bring out the Bohemian elements of it, and then a couple of images, especially near the end of the text, that he says are Hermetic images and texts that Hegel is drawing on. So, in the preface raises so his attitude toward the Hermeticism of Boehme and others is similar to his attitude toward mainstream religion. He believes that it approaches the truth very closely, but it's hindered by its sensuous mode of expression. Hegel opposes the school of romantic intuitionism, often inspired by Hermeticism, which believes the truth is to be felt or intuited. As you know, we were discussing before, Hegel's got this this is particularly, like, this is sort of his point. This was his break with what he saw. His break is with Boehme. His criticism of Boehme was that it was too wedded to sensuousness, and it needed to have a transcendence, an Aufhebung of sensuousness.
A Platonic ideal which is divorced from the material contingencies of reality.
McGee argues that Hegel's preface uses an apparently a famous line of saying that the absolute is the night in which all cows are black, to say that this was, McGee argues that this was an attack on Schelling's understanding of or representation of or presentation of Hermeticism. So the line before that, Hegel discusses A equals A as a criticism of Schelling's view of the absolute as the indifference point, which Schelling appropriated from Fichte. But it's also a criticism of the coincidence of opposites found in Cusa and others. Hegel also uses the phrase, therein all is one, which is really similar to instances, a philosophy that translated to English is all is one, which comes from Schelling. So Hegel's preface goes on to attack Schelling as the latest exponent of a type of mysticism which he believes is inadequate, a mysticism that stops short in the face of contradiction and declares that God is inconceivable. So Hegel, in effect, rejects this kind of mysticism in favor of the theosophy of Boehme.
One of the things he says, this is on page 137, is that Hegel opposes himself to all previous philosophy, and then he quotes him as saying, I appeal to you to lay aside the love of knowing and get around to actually knowing.
So, yeah, and he's discussing Ettinger. He's discussing, and it's from Ettinger that he gets the word Geist as a thing that cannot be divided into literal pieces, only into noetic moments. And in Geist, the whole is immanent in every part, and it is this immanence that enables us to progress from one moment to another in the gradual articulation of the whole. The theme of the truth as a whole, or the whole, is a perennial theme in Swabian speculative pietism. So in this context, Hegel is extorting Schelling to become more Boehmian. The surface of the preface involves Hegel opposing himself to all previous philosophy. The subtext, however, involves a response to all previous mysticism as well. And McGee argues that this was hidden in subtext because, one, intolerance against admirers of Ettinger's existed in Hegel's time, and so he had to be careful. So I guess this is a Straussian reading of Hegel here. But two, the phenomenology belongs to an older, he argues, the phenomenology belongs to an older tradition of literary work in which reference to one's predecessors, which was generally done indirectly. So that's why it's hidden in the subtext and not in the surface level of the text itself.
Kevin, just to really quickly add this, I think one important thing that McGee says is that Hegel rejects Schelling and the idea that, like, all cows are black in the night as like a system based on identity, and it's inherently pantheistic. But he also rejects mysticism because it lets the mystery remain. And I think that's a big difference about Hegel's system. It's like, no, it's like the idea of going through these moments means that there is no ineffable mystery about it. It's really the sort of tearing with the negative, going through the process to actually know what God is. Like, that is something that can be done. That is what, philosophia is, like love of knowledge, not seeking for it, but actually finding it is actually achieving that.
Yeah, he's saying that we should lay aside the love of knowledge, which is philosophy, and instead turn to theosophy, which is knowing the wisdom of God. That's what he's trying to do with this text. And that's what he says in the preface, and that is, sort of laying out what he's going to do in the Phenomenology. So in effect, Hegel is saying that mysticism is a clue to the nature of the absolute. Hegel opens the doors of his temple of absolute spirit to the Bohemian theosophists, saying, your God is my God, but if you wish to go a further step and truly know God, you must submit yourselves to the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of my initiation.
Well, this relates to what we mentioned a bit ago about sense certainty, and why is it that sense certainty is the initial division in the Phenomenology. So I also just think this is the best, most devastating criticism of cancel culture I've ever heard. So this is McGee says, Hegel's account of selfhood involves the claim that at some level the self relates to its other by willing its cancellation. At the root of all forms of spirit that unfold in the Phenomenology is a primal demonic drive for complete possession or mastery of the object, for in effect the annihilation of otherness. But by implication, this drive is simultaneously a will to remove the divide between subject and object, for by canceling otherness, it seeks to exalt the self. So I think this is a really key thing to actually make sense of a lot of like political discourse, is that the urge to like cancel or master otherness and thereby exalt the self is also like very blatantly what Hegel calls evil. So evil is in a sense complete mastery and dominance of the otherness of the object and subordinating it to that first stage of sense certainty and the development of consciousness.
Which he then comes back around to saying that evil is a moment of God. But to get back around to that, he says, to conclude this section, McGee says that it should be mentioned here that the meaning of the speculative is to be understood as being the same as what used to, in earlier times, be called mystical. Now, an interesting fact that I've very recently learned outside of this text is about the etymology of the word speculative, speculation, actually, which, the Calvinists, it comes from the ancient Greek about like reflection, and it was like the idea of like reflecting on things intentionally. The Calvinists used this word. Much of the writing that came before Hegel was that used this word. This word would appear in Calvinist writings fused with the the adjective idle, where they would call it with a negative value judgment, idle speculation, negatively judging people sitting around on their ass in ivory towers, thinking up lofty, stupid, useless, pointless ideas. In contrast to the positive value judgment of going out into the world and doing hard work and producing things.
Calvinism is the source of all evil.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, though,
Chad, yes.
This is also like at the beginning periods of the rise of capitalism, where speculation was coming to also mean the use of idle money that had been conglomerated, the money that had come together to speculate on commodities in a marketplace. This is what we nowadays continue to call in the finance, on Wall Street, what they do is speculation. And this meaning of the word also was beginning to appear in Hegel's context in his time. So the notion of idle speculation in an ivory tower where we sit and reflect on things condemned by the Calvinists, attached to the detached use of accumulated wealth in order to reinvest in commodity production as an essential feature of capitalism, is what Hegel is looking at and commenting on when he talks about speculation as mysticism and a necessary but insufficient moment in the process of becoming absolute, of the absolute becoming.
Another way to put it is evil is a moment of God.
Cancel culture is a moment of God.
Yeah, Kevin, that's actually fascinating, and I think it's illuminating because it shows the way in which nothing we're reading here, just like anything anywhere, can be read outside of its context, and also that the way that history works is that something can be true in one period and then not true in another, which is one of the things that Hegel argues in his introduction to the history of philosophy, is that truth is not transhistorical, but truth is actually extremely historicized.
Yes, and that is truth, and God is incarnated in a specific moment.
Yeah. Right. So the negative is the moment of the positive. That the seed of absolute spirit is present in every flawed form that spirit takes. This is all just further proof of Hegel's, alchemical, hermetic, and probably say it wrong, but Burmian ways of thinking.
I liked his idea, this is on 137, that the truth is a whole, and that the whole is immanent in every aspect of the truth. So it doesn't matter which part that you begin to contemplate, you are contemplating the entire truth by contemplating that one point of the truth.
Yeah.
Which is another, like when it comes to truth about religion, that's another super Masonic thing, is that every religion is contemplating an aspect of God.
So then McGee goes on to discuss his analysis of the text itself, and he's bringing out the Bohemian elements of the text itself to show that Hegel is a Hermetic and doing a Hermetic initiation right here. So he says that there was a Hermetic tradition of understanding self-consciousness as necessarily a product of alienation, as in Hegel's terms anyway. He recognized, or he supported Boehme's recognition that selfhood develops in opposition to the not self. But Boehme's unique development here is that he claimed that this must also apply to God as well. And Hegel includes in one of his lectures the following quote from Boehme: "Nothing can be revealed to itself without opposition. For if there is nothing that opposes it, then it always goes out of itself and never returns to itself again. It does not return to itself, if it does not return to itself as into that from which it originated, then it knows nothing of its origin."
Right. Marx's debt to Hegel is very, very clear here, but often not fully understood. And I think I only recently, actually through these various ways of trying to start understanding Hegel better, if I fully understood Marx, when he talks about the difference between a class in itself and a class for itself, right? And the class struggle, right? The proletariat coming into conflict with its coming into conflict, right? It is class struggle, which is what creates the proletariat. It's not just like you get your workers and your capitalists, and you're a worker because you get a paycheck. I mean, that's sense certainty, right? But it's class struggle. It's the formation of the classes, a collective entity with an aspiration greater than itself. It is when the proletariat becomes fully formed as a class for itself and completes the process of becoming, by that final engagement of, to use Hegelian terms, the moment of truth, or in Marxist terms, the class struggle, and then supersedes itself by transcending its otherness, by negating its negation, which is the process which gives rise to it in the first place.
I think that's one of the reasons why you see so often with a lot of like modern leftist and psychoanalytically influenced thinkers that the struggle is always to figure out, like, to say who is the revolutionary subject is really a way to say who is the force of negation against capitalism as it exists.
Yeah.
Yep.
Me. I am.
Yes.
Hell yeah.
Albinism.
But so we this conversation that we've been having over the course of the book Nihilist Communism, I think one of the things which I now find that I find so inadequate in that author's, the two people who wrote that book, their discourse on consciousness is, certainly, whatever. I don't want to make this about that, right? But they talk about consciousness as is not just like not a useful project in a propagandistic sense, but also not real, right? It's like this completely phony conception. It's a bourgeois conception, and that like it's acting on self-interest, which makes the revolution, and that's why the proletariat is historic, is the protagonist of this particular period in history, and like that's kind of true, but only in as much as it knows itself to be so. And I think that that's the missing ingredient. So when we're casting about for the agent of negation, right? We should continually find ourselves landing back at the proletariat, but only in as much as the proletariat is on the move as such. Because otherwise, you know, when you encounter the proletariat in its amorphous, atomized way, in its in the way in which it falls back into itself, right, as opposed to transcending itself, you don't find the embodiment of the will of history, the embodiment of spirit, or the class with that historic mission to abolish all class relations. You only find people working and hating it.
And that opposition is like Marx's material development of Hegel. But in the I suppose in the more idealist Hegel, opposition is where he comes to bring the devil into being as a moment of God. He says that selfhood involves the claim that at some level the self relates to its other by willing its cancellation. At the root of all forms of spirit that unfold in the phenomenology is a primal demonic drive for complete possession or master of the object, for in effect the annihilation of otherness. So the implication here is that the drive is simultaneously a will to remove the divide between subject and object. For by canceling otherness, it seeks to exalt the self. This implication is crucial for the understanding the section of self-consciousness. This drive is complete and utter negativity that ultimately issues in a complete and exalted positivity. And this is a Bohmian point to be made here that Hegel is making in the Phenomenology. And I think you can read a critique of capitalism in that as selfishness. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan's like ideology of the world is the essence of capitalism, and it's evil, but it's a necessary element in the development or moment in the development of being.
Well, sure. I mean, how else can we become fit to rule without having to first engage in this negativity, right? Which is a tool for the cunning of reason to realize all that is good, right? If we have been not and shall be all, it will only be in the process of not only like whatever overcoming social conditions and clashing with the bourgeoisie, right? But embodying the objective interests of all humanity to overcome alienation of man from nature, and from himself, which means that just as much as Lucifer is a moment of God to be redeemed, so too are individuals of the capitalist class ultimately, as human beings, only going to benefit from the coming of a full flowering of human freedom. It comes with the abolition of class distinctions and the riddle of history being solved.
Per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars.
And that's why it isn't just reason, it's the cunning of reason. It's precisely by pursuing negation and exaltation of the self that you bring about the very conditions which will negate your own self and create an Aufhebung, like a negation of negation, where those two, opposites relate to each other in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, right. The original calling of man is to be an image of God, but that can only be realized through cognition.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's why one must know thyself, and so on. That's how all of this is merely one aspect or another of a totality, which we can call the absolute.
And the only way to know ourselves is to know God, to see our reflection in God. But we can also only form a truer image of God by confronting ourselves and peeling away our projections that we make upon God. So there has to be a simultaneous movement of confronting ourselves and God at the same time in order to become ourselves.
That's exactly what I love. McGee's formulation here. Let me take that to this formulation that I absolutely love about his note about his Bohemianism in the Phenomenology. He notes that so he's talking about like the desire for, or the love of knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, is this evil impulse of the self trying to annihilate the other, because this annihilation is a transformative process. It takes what is and it transforms it into something else, which is an annihilation of the other into the self. And he notes that transformation can mean two things for Hegel. It can mean a noticeable change, like trees into houses or a child into an educated adult, or it can also mean the unknown into the known. So the desire, or the desire to know things, to know oneself, to know all things, to know the absolute, is a desire to make the unknown into the known. It is an expression of this evil desire to annihilate the other and make the self total. And it is this compulsion that actually draws us to God, to the absolute. So for Hegel, it is not enough for spirit to change the world. It must interpret it.
Yeah. And like, there is a really one of my favorite philosophers and theologians, a Jewish theologian and philosopher, Martin Buber, points out this, that, as Kevin talked about now, the I and thou relationship, that we confront ourselves and that we try to make the other into ourselves, this this demonic impulse to make the thou into a thing.
You guys remember that Red Library episode where I mistook Martin Buber for Theodor Herzl? And I was like, yeah, fuck that guy. And everyone's like, what? Why?
So there's so much fucking here. It's hard for me to just like go through it quickly enough to fit into the time frame we're doing. So I'm not really sure what to pick out and what not to pick out of here. But I really love his discussion of talking about humans as animals in this regard, that the literal just animal drive to breathe and to eat is to draw in the external world and into oneself, and literally absorb it, literally annihilate the external by drawing it into the self. And this is where he's able to draw in alchemical imagery into the text as well. He brings up sense certainty as part of the initiation, the initial division of the phenomenology. Is the most basic and primitive form of the urge to cancel or master the other, manifesting itself in the consciousness. Self-sense certainty thinks it can grasp the singularity of the object as a this in its pure immediacy, but Hegel writes, an actual sense certainty is not merely this pure immediacy, but an instance of it. So consciousness had wanted to grasp the other in its individuality, but the other eludes our grasp. I'm on to page 41, bottom of 41 at this point, if you're trying to keep
141, right?
141, sorry.
Yeah, usually whenever somebody is doing like an overview, like in a lecture or like book length introduction to Hegel, their treatment of this is pretty much reserved to or restricted to the master-slave dialectic, and not without reason, because it's like a pretty it's pretty good. It helps explain a lot. But I think it also, just like most, at least that I've encountered, most scholarship on Hegel, it just kind of leaves out the key. And it makes it just sound like, oh, Hegel's the guy who thinks this. Rather than, like it doesn't explain why Hegel thought he had finished the project of philosophy.
Well, just as an example of this, if anyone has read the Miller translation, in Miller's introduction, there is literally a point where he's like, listen, I don't know what the fuck this guy is saying. Here's some general ideas, but I really don't know.
Yeah.
And that's Miller's
What's great about
introduction.
that, though, is at the back of the Miller, there's a like a paragraph by paragraph, like summary and explanation. I don't get it, but here, I'll write about it. I will literally define for you and for most people, like I will set the standard for what this all means.
Yeah. I mean, man, the more I engage with academia, the more I feel I have I feel like academia and most of academia is just totally fucking worthless. It's just just people spinning their wheels just to publish something. It's so stupid.
Academics,
especially in the like humanities and the like critical and critical studies and whatever kind of shit, which is the part where the area of the academia where you're going to find Marxists. I'll just he basically uses the rest of this section to talk about how Hegel's position is Bohme's position, and the negative moment in human nature is original sin. Original sin is a tool used by the cunning of reason to actualize all that is good, which is religion, morality, science, society, justice, and ultimately God himself. And so it is through, and then he goes on and uses a Bohmian myth of about the fall of Lucifer, and he uses this as a demonstration that evil is a moment of God. And that's how the text is Bohmian. The next bits of that McGee analyzes in the Phenomenology of Spirit is he notes some appearances of alchemical imagery used throughout the text, and then a specific myth or a poem that he uses about the foaming chalice as in part is what do you call it, the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail, and he goes into a deep analysis of this poem and how it's Bohmian and Hermetic, and he's communicating this particular message, which I could get into detail about. We could get into detail about that if that's what y'all want to discuss, but that is where this chapter concludes.
Rather than get into detail about it, I think that the important part of it is really just the recognition, and I think the illumination of the fact that Hegel is not only completely convinced that he has arrived at absolute knowing in the process of working out his system, but that he says so very explicitly and also implicitly, and the conscious appropriation of this Holy Grail imagery, which is worth reading, is more than just like a cool allegory, right? Like it really says a lot about what Hegel believes. Hegel is the first person to complete a Grail quest. He tells us how he did it, and he says, I think this is in the book, that as others have pointed out, that every single human being, Emma Jung notes that traditionally the philosopher's stone is at once priceless as well as the most common thing there is trodden underfoot in the street, because it is a particle of God concealed in nature. And the point of all that is to allude to the fact that every human being is its potential bearer and even its begetter.
Yeah, and he does a whole discussion about why the Philosopher's Stone is the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, that's an important part. I just kind of breezed right through.
And we cannot stress this enough that for Hegel, both sin and fall and evil are moments of God. An image of this would be that in our search for God, in our search for a better world, we will be bruised, we will be cracked. But when we create ourselves, gaze upon the face of God, those cracks, those sins, which is emptiness, will be filled with gold. In some artwork, you use gold to fill in the cracks.
Yeah.
And I think that is a great way of illustrating our quest for communism, for a better world, for facing God, that when we have reached the goal, the previous mistakes will not be forgotten, but glorified. The blood of the martyrs will be stains upon us, but those stains will become a work of art.
So I want to tag on something that might relate back to what we were discussing earlier for my final thought. So what you're describing here is a Japanese theory of aesthetics called kintsugi. It's where you like break a teapot or a teacup and then refashion it back together with gold. I will just say there are many roads to the same mountaintop, and as a former Zen Buddhist, you can do the Hegelian route, right? You can do the whole phenomenology Grail quest thing, and that's cool, man. That's fine. But I also just want to let people know you can do the koan Zen thing, which is you just answer the question, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And you get hit with a stick a bunch of times. So, it's your choice.
Right. Well, it's like you don't have to be a Marxist to make the revolution, but it might help. Mir, you reminded me of a Brecht poem about to those who follow in our wake or to those who come after. Are you familiar with this one?
Yeah.
He says, yet we know even the hatred of squalor distorts one's features. Even anger against injustice makes the voice grow hoarse. We who wish to lay the foundation for gentleness could not ourselves be gentle. But you, when at last the time comes that man can aid his fellow man, should think upon us with leniency.
With forgiveness is the Swedish translation.
Oh, I like that better.
Yeah.
Think upon us with forgiveness.
And just, a word of warning to those who are attempting to purify themselves in advance of their Grail quest. You must choose wisely, because the true Grail will bring you life. The false Grail will take it from you.